Who are interested in housing attainability and community connectedness. We are delighted to have you join us today. Yeah, I imagine more folks will be filing in the next couple of minutes. So in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind dropping your name in the chat where you're joining us from, and what your interest in housing is, whether you are a city planner, a small scale developer, or just somebody who cares about increasing affordable options for folks in your community. My name is Lauren Cole. I'm the policy manager for Wasatch Advocates for Livable Communities, or WALC for short. We are a nonpartisan 501(c)(3) nonprofit working to help communities across Utah plan for enough housing to welcome both current and future neighbors. Our work is a part of a broader national movement to address housing shortages, expand housing choice, and support more connected, opportunity-rich communities. WALC helps residents, local leaders, and community partners better understand the decisions, helping shape Utah's communities and support practical, people-centered solutions that expand housing choice and opportunity. Our work is evidence-based, collaborative, and grounded in the belief that more people should be able to live in the communities of their choice at prices that they can afford. And we're excited today to be joined by Mike Hathorne. He's an
Oh,
author. I know I messed
you
it up.
did
It's
it.
my Midwest showing. But you're gonna have to correct your last name once again. But Mike is an author and urban strategist and real estate development leader whose work examines the forces reshaping housing and neighborhood development across the United States. He is the author of a recently published book, and that has a second edition on the way, called The Great Housing Reversal and the New American Dream, which examines the growing shift in housing demand towards neighborhoods where daily needs, economic opportunity, and community life are more closely connected. His work explores how the rules, institutions, and development practices that shape land ultimately determine the kinds of neighborhoods communities are able to build. Mike's work focuses on restoring alignment between land, governance, and human settlement patterns. His writing and professional work emphasize practical frameworks for creating neighborhoods that are resilient, economically vibrant, and capable of supporting community life across generations. After 18 years of living and working in Utah, Mike now lives and works in Northwest Arkansas, where he focuses on advancing walkable, mixed-use communities that strengthen the social, economic, and environmental performance of place. And today's conversation is a part of WALC's ongoing Lunch and Lead series. We try to do these at least once a quarter, where we bring a conversation like this that is focused on other thought partners whose work aligns with our vision at WALC. So we're excited. After I read Mike's book, wanted to invite him in for a conversation. And so the way today will go is Mike is going to take it away for about 15 to 20 minutes and give a brief presentation, a high level overview of his research, and what comes out of his book. And then we will have a short fireside chat, some questions that relate there too. And then we will turn it over to you all for other questions and responses from Mike. So Mike, thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it to you.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Let me tee this up to presentation mode. We were just as a little sidebar, we Lauren and I were having a conversation before we started about how to say my last name. and and we went through that twice and what typically happens, I'm used to it. I Everybody leads with Hawthorne because I think that's what folks are used to. But it is said Hathorne, so that we'll put that aside. I'm thrilled to be here with you this afternoon to talk about housing and to do it through the lens that I've created for myself and those that have been able to read my book, The Great Housing Reversal and the New American Dream. I want to begin by revisiting a quote from Governor Cox from December of 2023. Quote, "We're going to build 35,000 starter homes over the next 5 years. We're going to do that. We're going to make it happen." In this quote, it would seem that Governor Cox is framing Utah's housing problem primarily as a shortage of units. But the deeper problem that needs to be addressed is the mismatch between the housing Utah has been organized to produce and the households Utah is becoming. Otherwise, Utah can build more homes and still miss the need. That is not an argument against supply. Utah needs more housing. It is an argument for asking a more complete set of questions. More of what, where, in what form, for which households, and in what kind of neighborhood. Looking at this through a lens of the great housing reversal begins with the recognition that households, life stages, and expectations have changed faster than the housing system built to serve them. Today, I want to explore what that means in a state that remains young, family oriented, and fast growing, but is also aging and forming households differently. Utah's growth story remains real. The state has about 3.54 million residents in 2025, and the Gardner Institute projects roughly 5.6 million by 2065. But a population projection is not a housing program. By 2065, nearly 1 in 4 Utahns will be 65 or older. Average household size is expected to keep declining. The number of residents rises while the composition and needs of their households continue to change. That leads to the central premise for this conversation. Utah needs more homes, but the total alone cannot tell us which homes, for whom, or where they belong. Population matters, jobs matter, migration matters, but people do not consume housing simply as population. Households consume housing, and the nature of those households is undergoing a significant reversal. So I want to distinguish between two problems. Utah has a housing shortage. That is a quantity question. How much housing do we need? Utah also has a housing mismatch. That is a different question. What kind of housing, for whom, at what price, in what tenure, and in what neighborhood? These aren't competing explanations. We can have too little housing overall, and at the same time, too little of the particular housing that increasingly diverse households need. That distinction matters here because Utah's mission shouldn't simply be about producing units. It should be about expanding access to housing choices. And choice requires us to understand not only how much housing Utah needs, but whether the housing we produce actually fits the lives people are living. And none of this means the Wasatch Front or any part of rural Utah need the same housing response. The point of demographic intelligence is precisely the opposite. Understand who your households are becoming locally and expand the choices that fit that reality. Here's one of the clearest illustrations. Utah is not demographically average. It still has the nation's largest average household size in the country, but its direction of travel is trending downward. The Gardner Institute reports that average household size declined from 4 people in 1940 to 3.1 in 2019. The latest census quick facts measure is 3 compared with 2.53 nationally. Smaller households do two things at once. They require more houses, they require more homes to house the same number of people, and they broaden the range of housing products that can fit those households. A state can remain family oriented while also needing apartments, cottages, townhomes, duplexes, small homes, and accessible downsizing choices. Utah can experience population growth and still face substantial housing pressure if people are organizing themselves into smaller households. But there is another implication. A household of 4 people does not necessarily need the same housing product as a household of 3. So the question changes from simply how many homes to how many homes and what kinds. That is the beginning of the housing mismatch. Household size tells only part of the story. Utah's family profile is still distinctive. Family households with children are more common here than nationally, and the state has the nation's lowest share of one-person households. But lowest share does not mean small market. More than 1 in 5 Utah households consists of one person. That includes young adults, divorced adults, widows and widowers, and older residents living alone. The point is not to replace family housing with small housing. It is to build the whole housing ladder so that young adults, growing families, empty nesters, and older residents can find a home that fits without being forced out of their community. Utah is the youngest state, but the headline can hide a faster moving change. The Census Bureau found that Utah's median age rose by a full year from 2020 to 2024, placing it among the fastest aging states in the country. 28 of Utah's 29 counties grew older, and 7 already had median ages above 40. At the other end of the life cycle, Utah's total fertility rate fell to 1.8 in 2023, which is below the replacement rate of 2.1 and down or flat for 15 consecutive years. This does not mean Utah is no longer a family state. It means the housing market must serve more stages at the same time: household formation, family growth, downsizing, accessibility, and aging in community. So put those pieces together. Today, Utah's household might be a single adult. It might be a couple without children, a traditional family with children, a single parent, a multi-generational household, an empty nester, an older adult living alone. And these aren't simply demographic categories. Each represents a different combination of income, space requirements, mobility, tenure preference, and life circumstance. Then compare that diversity with the products our system must routinely deliver: detached houses at one end and large apartment buildings at the other. The space between those poles is what we often call missing middle housing. The Utah Foundation found that more than 88% of residential land in Salt Lake County is zoned single family. Small middle housing projects often need added approvals or rezoning, adding uncertainty, time, and cost. That's what I mean by mismatch, and this is important. The mismatch isn't necessarily evidence that developers are building the wrong thing. It may be evidence that our system makes a relatively narrow range of things easiest to build. And that distinction takes us from blaming individual actors. Whoops. Blaming individual actors to examining the housing delivery system itself. A reasonable question is, if households want something different, won't the market respond? Sometimes that can be true, but housing isn't an ordinary consumer product. Before demographic demand becomes a housing unit, it has to survive a long sequence of decisions. There has to be suitable land. The project has to be entitled. The product has to comply with zoning and building codes. It has to be designed efficiently, and ultimately it has to be financed. A developer can recognize demand for a product that cannot be entitled. A municipality can legalize a product that lenders do not understand. A lender can finance a project that construction economics ultimately make infeasible. So this is one of the central ideas of the Great Housing Reversal. The housing market does not deliver everything households might want. It delivers what survives the entire delivery system. This is what I mean when I say zoning is a city's DNA. Zoning determines which urban forms are allowed to reproduce. When the code narrows the range of legal forms, the market signal never receives a fair test. This is where housing choice becomes much more than a menu of building types. Think about one person moving through life. As a young adult, an apartment or studio may make sense. As part of a couple, perhaps a townhome or small home. A growing household may need something larger. A divorce, death of a spouse, or other life change may suddenly produce a very different housing need. An empty nester may want something smaller. An older adult may eventually need greater accessibility. And across all of those stages, the preference might be to rent or to own. So I think we should ask a different question. Why should a change in life stage require a change in community? Why should someone have to leave their neighbors, social networks, familiar businesses, church, parks, doctors, or community simply because the house that fit at age 42 no longer fits at age 72? A resilient community doesn't merely provide housing, it provides enough housing choice that people can change homes without necessarily having to leave the community they call home. And fit is also part of affordability. A smaller unit that requires two cars and long trips for every daily need may not actually reduce the household's cost of living. An older homeowner who cannot find an accessible downsizing option nearby may remain in a house larger than needed because leaving the house means leaving the community. Housing affordability is affected not only by the price of the unit, but by the life the location requires. There is another implication here, and I think it is worth carrying into the conversation Lauren and I will have in a few minutes. We usually describe the relationship in one direction. Demographics shape housing demand. That is true, but housing can also shape demographics. Cost, availability, and neighborhood access can influence whether young adults stay, whether households form, whether workers move in, whether families remain, and whether older adults stay connected. Utah's tension is the point. It remains young and family oriented, but it is also experiencing high housing costs, lower fertility, and rapid aging. We should be careful not to claim housing alone causes those changes, but we should be equally careful not to assume the housing system is irrelevant to them. Building more is necessary. Building a complete housing ladder is the larger civic task. Everything so far can sound like a values argument. Expand choice because it would be good for households. I believe that, but I am also a developer and development has to work economically. As a case study example, I want to show you the 1907 block in downtown Rogers, Arkansas. It combines 56 residential units with retail, food and beverage, office uses on roughly 1 acre. The Ritter and Spool apartment portion was delivered at approximately $47,000 less per unit than a nearby conventional apartment comparison. That wasn't achieved by ignoring economics. It came through intentional planning, material selection, and close developer contractor collaboration. And that is the point I want to leave with you. Responding to changing households does not necessarily mean accepting worse economics. Different product can mean different opportunity. Demographic intelligence can inform site selection. It can change unit mix. It can change the way we think about amenities. It can influence phasing. It can expose market segments that conventional products aren't serving. And it can make us ask better questions before we simply repeat what we already know how to build. So let me return to where I started. Utah needs more housing. I don't question that. But the bigger question is more of what and for whom. If the household has changed, the decisions throughout the housing system have to change with it. For developers, that means using demographic intelligence to rethink product mix, unit size, tenure, phasing, and the households a project is actually designed to serve. For lenders, it means asking whether familiar underwriting practices unintentionally favor a narrow range of housing products simply because those products are familiar, not necessarily because they are the best fit for the market that is emerging. For municipalities, it means examining whether zoning, entitlement, infrastructure standards, and approval processes provide enough room for the housing choices local households increasingly need. And for advocates and neighborhood leaders, it means making the conversation more specific. More of what, where, in what form, for which households. None of this suggests that every community should build the same thing. In fact, the opposite is true. Demographic intelligence should help communities make more locally appropriate decisions. The challenge is to read the demographics, expand the choices, remove the bottlenecks, and test what works. Because if the households Utah's if the households Utah is becoming are different from the households our housing system was originally built around, then continuing to make the same decisions will continue to produce the same mismatch. The question is no longer simply how much housing Utah needs. The question is whether the housing system Utah builds next will fit the households Utah is becoming. And with that, Lauren, I think we have plenty to talk about.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks, Mike. That was wonderful. I invite folks to start throwing some questions in the chat. We are going to transition into some question and answer portion. Before doing so, two figures that stood out to me, that despite the demographic shifts that you're talking about, that Utah has the largest average home size of any state in the country. I believe last time I checked, it was 2,800 square feet. And the second is that 88% of residential land in Salt Lake County is zoned for single family detached homes only. And I imagine if we looked at things like the National Zoning Atlas and others, we would find that those figures are very similar for Utah County, or Weber County, Wasatch County, et cetera. But yeah, my first question for you, Mike, is what happens if Utah meets its housing goal, the figure you were talking about at the front of our conversation from Governor Cox, but builds primarily at the edge or in isolated projects?
Well, there's two effects. One is not meeting the need as it pertains to Utah's households, because what he's talking about is simply quantity and quantity in the make of starter homes. The other issue is pushing that into a greenfield setting, pushing housing to the edge, which means that you're now taxing those households in terms of other aspects of making your household work. I touched on that in relation to meeting your daily needs. In my mind, that's a very important component in all of this, because the degree to which you're able to meet your daily needs without getting in your car means that you're reducing your household expense as it pertains to travel. Um, I think that is absolutely critical in all of this, and that's part of the macro level problem as it pertains to the aspects of zoning and policy, because that's something that's not necessarily a status quo measure of delivery.
Yeah, sounds like we need to redefine what's meant by starter home, based on a lot of the conversation that we've had. Um, I'd love if you could share a bit about what happens when housing becomes legal. So zoning allows for these new housing
Yeah.
to be delivered, but could remain unbuildable, unfinanceable, or unrepeated. Like, what are some of the factors that could create
Well,
that?
I think the best example is understanding all of the things that impact as it pertains to policy. Zoning is one of them. And I think there's a lot of effort that's gone into addressing the zoning aspect as it pertains to housing. But where I've seen personally in my work here in Arkansas, where there's another impact is fire codes. If I have an example, I won't call out the city here specifically, but there was a city that had an ordinance that required fire sprinklers on detached products, so duplexes, townhomes, et cetera. What that does is that immediately inflates the cost of the housing, because ultimately to make things work, you need to be able to address market policy and economics. So if you have a fire code that says you need to fire sprinkler a townhome as opposed to 2 hour fire ratings on the attached walls, you're now increasing the cost of the unit, which means economically the developer is going to shy away from that. What that did in this particular city from the time that they adopted the ordinance, they didn't have any duplexes or townhomes built. They repealed that ordinance 2 months ago, which has since corrected the problem. You're starting to see townhomes and duplexes make their way into the system because you've cleared a hurdle. So that's an example within the realm of policy where yes, you can address the zoning aspect of the missing middle, but there are other gates that have to be met that if aren't met, it's gonna put a stop on being able to make any progress as it pertains to other housing types.
Yeah. Are there other examples you would call out that are friction points beyond building codes? Other things that you've seen come up in your work or just other anecdotes?
Well, I would say that on the developer side, um, I don't want to necessarily just defend developers because I think that developers are guilty of simply shying away from certain housing types simply because it's not what they do. Yet they're used to working within a system that delivers single family detached homes on one end, large apartment buildings on the other end, and at best, some townhomes in the middle. Anything else is outside of their realm because the one of the keys from a developer standpoint is being able to replicate what it is that they're doing. They don't want to have to R&D every single time they build something. They want to put something into their repertoire and be able to take it on the road to go from city to city. And if one city is progressive and they have things set up for, let's say, cottage courts. Some builders might gravitate to that because they see it as an opportunity. They have a level of demographic intelligence to understand there's a market for that. Others might say, you know what, that's not what we do, and we don't want to spend the money to R&D cottage courts because we know when we go to the city next door, we're not going to be able to use it, and it's going to sit on our shelves. So there are, and then lastly, I think from an economic standpoint, anytime you introduce new housing types into the market, it takes a while for the financiers to be able to accept it, because you have to be it has to appraise. Daybreak went through this when they first started. They introduced housing types that there were no comparables. So they had to, in essence, create their own comparables in order for financing to work its way into the system and not be the dam that's preventing things to move. So, I mean, those are, looking at the, market policy and economics, I think those are examples in each one of those realms.
Yeah, great call on Daybreak. Mike worked really closely on that development. And like you said, I think at first was probably seen as this cutting edge, creative, innovative, who's going to want to live here, and now is one of the more desirable places to live in Utah, and in South Jordan in particular. Um, Another question I have for you is how can Utah combine housing abundance with lasting affordability and the choice between rental and home ownership? So you talked about both prongs, increasing supply, but then also increasing a certain type of supply. How do we get at
Yeah.
affordability as the underlying goal of both of those premises? How is affordability the outcome of both of those prongs?
Well, I mean, if you look holistically, in my mind, as to how the system needs to work, looking at it through a lens of demographic intelligence, it's understanding that as you introduce housing types that are meeting the needs of particular household types, you're starting to balance the marketplace because part of one of the things that I refer to is we have a bit of a log jam with certain housing types because there's no room for movement into something that is a better fit. You know, I'm watching my parents go through this right now. They're in a house that is far bigger than they need, but they don't want to leave their community. And within their community, there aren't any legitimate options for them to downsize. So there's a conundrum. Do I leave my community, go somewhere else, and have to start over? Or do I stay in a house that is way too big, which could potentially be part of the logjam? A family that or a household that's a better fit could go into that home as they downsize into something that's a better fit for them. So the balancing within the marketplace needs to occur with the introduction of housing types that are a better fit for the household types within a given market. And again, this is to speak locally and regionally because what's needed on the Wasatch Front isn't necessarily the same thing that might be needed in rural parts of Utah. So that's where the demographic intelligence comes in terms of understanding what is the nature of the market that we're looking to fix, and then going about the process of fixing it.
Yeah, I've heard you say a few, in addition to affordability, and sorry, I'm throwing a few other questions at you that you
No,
may not have
yeah,
prepared for, but you use the word like community care a few times, and I want you to sort of, yeah, tease that out a little bit of how where we live, and the types of communities that we live in are tethered to a sense of community and connectedness,
yeah,
and how some of the mismatch that is appearing also takes away from a sense of community and long-term
yeah.
care for folks, especially folks that are seeking to age in place.
I appreciate you asking that because that's something I'm passionate about personally because of one, my own experiences, two, the experiences of family, including my children, and how we've been trained socially as it pertains to that question. In terms of community care, ultimately what we want is we want people to invest socially in where they live. And when that occurs, it makes it that much harder to relocate, to disconnect. And the way things work today, housing is built in quantities, in concentration, and so we have all been trained that as our needs change, we literally have to uproot and move ourselves somewhere else. We're moving to a new city, we're moving to a new location that has disconnected us from where we have planted roots. When we understand that that's what we have to do, it makes it that much more difficult for us to be willing to invest ourselves and to be willing to be part of the community, because we know we can all kind of gauge this housing is going to meet my needs for X number of years, and then I'm going to have to move from city X to city Y to meet my new needs. It's just because the system isn't working correctly. If that's one of the that's one of the social benefits that it really should be part of the discussion. Um, but we have to remember that ultimately, um, what we're talking about is a physical and an economic system that needs to be fixed first. Because if you can't make it pencil, it's not going to get built. So that has to be fixed. This is the social correction in terms of community care that allows people to know, you know what? I know that I am going to move into this neighborhood, and I'm going to be able to meet my needs as my needs change. I lived in Daybreak for 18 years. I lived in 5 different homes in Daybreak during those 18 years. And the only thing I had to do is I still maintain the connections uh, within Daybreak from day zero to when I moved out, even though my location changed while my housing type changed as I made those moves. That should be the goal. That should be the objective.
Yeah, well said. I have one final question for you, and then other folks in the chat, it looks like have some thoughtful questions coming through. My final question is, what tests should pro-housing advocates like myself and many people in this Zoom room use when evaluating a project or a code change? What are some of the metrics and values that we should be thinking about as we think about this realignment and yeah, creating more need?
So what I would say, and I'm going to really quickly for the sake of answering that question, I'm going to go back to this slide. So to understand that and to understand that well is to understand the process. Whoops, I guess I got to share the screen. You need to understand the process that things go through and understand these touch points, because at any one of these touch points, you're either going to have an open or a closed gate that's going to impact the system of delivery. If there's not available land in the right location, that's important. It's not just land, because that's the question that we talked about earlier. You can always go to the edge, which is not the most responsible thing to do. Um, but sometimes it's necessary. There has to be the land in the right location. The entitlement has to be there, which is related to the zoning code. The entitlement is the development right, which is kind of the offshoot of what the zoning allows. And then design has to correspond with what the entitlement and the zoning are. And then understanding that at the end of the day, all of this has to be financed. The developer has to be able to finance it, and the consumer has to be able to finance it. So I think that's the critical, understanding that path, I think, is probably the best way of understanding how to measure things along the way. Because in understanding that, you then know who you're dealing with. You're dealing with landowners, you're dealing with government, both city and state government. You're dealing with designers, urban design, landscape architects, and then you're dealing with developers and financiers. That's a I mean that's a very significant pipeline. You compare that pipeline to other consumer products, technology, for example, they don't necessarily go through a pipeline that's that complicated. In development, that's what you're dealing with. So from an advocacy standpoint and walk, I think it's understanding that and who the players are, so that you can understand whether there's a closed or an open gate that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, so many levels of regulation to attack at different levels.
Yes.
Yeah, I am gonna have Jessica facilitate the questions in the chat for our remaining time.
Yes, so this one is a multi-parter, so I'm just going to read the whole thing,
Okay.
and then you kind of pick up or answer whatever you want. And for those attending, we do plan on kind of having these questions answered after and being able to answer those after. So if we don't get to all of them, please know we hope to get to them. But this one is: have you looked into the PIDs in the state? Should the affordable housing be more of a mandate or an incentive for developers? Where is affordable housing working, and what are they doing differently? There has been several discussions about what is considered an affordable home. 120% of median income to qualify. Pricing is a moving target. So how do you plan for a future pricing in a development? So like I said, multi-parter.
Wow. That is a very complex set of issues there. Just for the sake of the entire listening body, there's an affordability metric that's I guess looked at from a government perspective that's relative to area median income, AMI, and it's looked at in terms of a percentage. 100% means it's at the median, and below that, you're starting to talk about folks that aren't meeting the median income within a given area, and then obviously above 120%, you're making good money there. Um, I guess I would say that the affordability question has to be determined both at a state and a local level. Um, I I have tried to disconnect myself from what's going on in Utah because I'm not there anymore. I'm tied to the market in Arkansas now. But I will speak in general because I think there's some issues of affordability that are going to be the same regardless of where you are. Um, I think it's a question that has to be looked at in terms of trends. It also has to be looked at in terms of both city and region. Affordable housing is something that I do know from my time in Utah. The state has legislated that every city has to have an affordable housing plan within their general plan. And not every city views affordable housing the same way. Some cities have taken the view that other cities surrounding them should be the ones that are addressing the burden from a regional standpoint while they maintain a higher AMI. Um, I think as an example, I think affordable housing should be viewed the same way that you view air quality. Air quality is a regional issue. It doesn't stop at city boundary lines. Everybody should be contributing towards delivering on an affordable housing strategy that is more collective as opposed to singular. Right now, it's singular. It's at the city level, and it stops at the borders. And similar to air quality, it doesn't work that way. You're causing problems. If you think again, going back to the system that we talked about, you're creating imbalance in the system by saying we're going to ignore certain housing types to be within the gravity of our community or our city, and that creates problems within the system regionally. And I think that's something that ought to be considered strategically, because it shouldn't be the burden of some while others simply take households that are maybe at or above a given AMI, because those AMIs translate into sales tax. And those that lower AMIs don't compete as well. And sales tax is something that is addressed at the city level, not regionally in Utah. And so if somebody's carrying a heavier burden in terms of affordable housing, they're disadvantaged when it comes to attracting sales tax through commercial businesses. So, I guess I would say fix the problem by thinking in terms of regional strategy.
Perfect. The next question is, you mentioned before that lenders need to learn to underwrite projects that are not the current standard. Is this something that advocates can help push them to do? Are their non-standard projects profitable enough that they can be predictably entitled lenders? Will Simplify decide to do this on their own?
Um, so I'll talk about it from a developer standpoint as opposed to the consumer standpoint. Because without covering the developer standpoint, you're not going to get to the consumer standpoint. From a developer standpoint, they're both the same in that the different housing type or the different development pattern needs to be understood by the financier so that it can be financed. Looking at Daybreak as an example, it's now very easy to show that a different development pattern is profitable. That question can be put to bed. Over the years, I heard all sorts of speculation by other developers saying Daybreak isn't profitable because X, Y, or Z. Daybreak's being propped up in some way. Um, you know, having lived in Daybreak for 18 years, having worked on Daybreak, I feel like I know what has gone on well enough to say Daybreak is extremely profitable, both on the development side as well as on the consumer side. Um, Arguably on the consumer side, you could argue it's been too profitable. There's consumers pay a premium now to be in Daybreak. It appraises and values much higher than what's around it. That's a supply problem. That should tell us that we should look to that pattern as being more status quo than it is today. Um, you know, but yeah, it's helping. It's being able to point to examples, and Daybreak is the local one. I talk about one in my book that's just outside of Louisville, Kentucky, called Norton Commons. A study was done on Norton Commons to look at this stuff. I won't go into the details, but yes, it's being able to show that it's profitable, and where there's money to be made, there's money to be lent, and I think that's the key.
Perfect. The next one is, what are the most common gaps or misunderstandings you see between developers and local communities? How can we, advocates, municipal leaders, and developers, bridge those gaps?
Oh man, I'm so glad that question came up. What we need to, and this is, I think there's a lot of work that can be done at the level of WALC as it pertains to this. It's to not think about a development proposal as the housing unit, but to think of it in terms of the people that it's impacting. The problem, and this is I mean, for good reason, in the system as it exists today, people look at what's coming and what they see is something that's different in housing type and household type from what they are. And because it's a quantity play, because it's coming in concentration, it makes it scary. If we are working within an ecosystem that is more granular and more incremental, it's not as scary because you're going to see housing type in terms of the people that it's serving. And I mean, I have been in meetings. I have been in city council meetings where the people are talked about as a commodity. And I facetiously reference it in terms of the economics of those people and where they shop. In that, in a meeting, you'll hear city council people say, hey, we're target people. We don't want any more Walmart people in our community. That's economic segregation, which is a legal way of segregating. It doesn't make it right, but it is a legal form of segregation. If we're dealing at on a more of a granular level, but that's hard to do because you've got to have the land within a granular system to behave this way. If it's more granular, though, you can talk in terms of the people, you can talk in terms of the ecosystem, you can talk in terms of what's missing, and you can talk about there is a jigsaw puzzle piece missing that this is allowing to fit. We're helping to fix the ecosystem by delivering this. If we can get to that point, then things are gonna get or work better. But we've got to change the system, and that's tough rowing, but it's not something that's unachievable. I'm in an environment here in Northwest Arkansas that works. It's accepting of this. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm not in Utah anymore. I'm working for a developer that does this by right. They've been doing it for almost 20 years, and we don't have to fight about delivering walkable communities that are mixed residential and that contribute to meeting daily needs.
I think that kind of goes into our next question is how are you transitioning this lot home discussion back to the design of neighborhoods with communities of people we want to maintain our connections with? Both new town slash neighborhoods and infill thoughts are appreciated.
Yeah, well, I mean, here in Arkansas, we're doing both. We're working on. We've done the example that I showed you in the slide presentation of the Ritter and Spool block, or excuse me, the 1907 block with the Ritter and Spool apartments. That was an infill project within the downtown of Rogers, Arkansas. We've got I live in a community called Johnson Square, which is an evolving traditional neighborhood in Johnson, Arkansas, which is just north of Fayetteville. We've got a 200 plus acre project that we're working on in South Fayetteville. Um, we're working on these projects in these communities because we have the existing DNA that will allow us to do it. If the DNA wasn't there, we wouldn't be in those cities. There are cities that we have chosen to not be there yet because the ecosystem hasn't gotten to the point where we feel like we're a fit. We know we can work in Rogers. We know we can work in Johnson. We know that we can work in Fayetteville. And so that's where we're pressing forward. So as a developer, it's understanding, if you want to do traditional neighborhoods, if you want to do this, if you want to deliver a different development pattern, it's knowing where that DNA exists, where it's in place, and then being able to run with it.
And our next question is what advice would you give to cities trying to find a new balance of right sizing their DNA to address the mismatch while not raising the barrier of entry for a small scale builder slash developer?
Wow. I'm trying to decide how freely to speak on this one. Um, I'm going to take a middle approach on this because I have some experience in this arena in Utah, and it's part of the reason that I'm in Northwest Arkansas now. Um, I think from a city perspective, you have to understand the uh, you have to understand the rules of policy that you're delivering. There are you can take things too far. You can be too prescriptive. You can be too heavy-handed. In Utah, well, and it's not just in Utah, but I'll speak to Utah specifically on this. There is a bright line between, from a developer standpoint, in terms of one of these open and closed gates as to whether the process requires legislative action versus administrative action. The degree to which you have to enter the world of legislative action means that any action taken is potentially subject to referendum. Now, the state is trying to fix that in terms of setting the ground rules for what can and can't be referred to, or a referendum could be enacted against, and the rules for that. But you can try to do the right thing and set the DNA. And if the legislative bar is too high, meaning you haven't addressed things in a way to allow the developer to work within the administrative arena, meaning that you're not going to city council, you've set the rules, and as long as you're meeting the rules, things can be handled administratively without having to go to city council. Then developers, they will often they'll turn their back on that. And then being too prescriptive as to the rules and taking away flexibility. It's important to understand in all of this that both the developer and government need to understand that they need to balance certainty and flexibility in the system. If there's too much certainty and not enough flexibility for the developer, what it often does is it becomes overreach into aspects of, we'll call it unwritten market policy that the developer is subject to. If government policy is dictating market forces, then the developer will oftentimes turn their back on that too, because if the time horizon for a project is longer than a given market cycle, then it puts the developer in a position where it could absolutely destroy them. So there's balancing that needs to occur within government to understand what the different avenues of governance are for the developer so that there's not overreach, and then understanding where that line is between legislative and administrative action. I think those are two areas of heavy sensitivity that exist for the developer.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And I will pass it back to Lauren.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. So much wisdom and insight. I wanted to leave, I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but I wanted to leave a couple of minutes at the end to wrap up. I wondered if you could share how people could get a hold of you if they have additional questions that either didn't get answered today or are percolating as they're thinking about the things that you've shared. And then where they could find your book, where your book is available for them.
Well, I guess the way that you can get a hold of me would be through LinkedIn and also on Substack. I have a Substack. I work very hard to try and write an article weekly that I publish every Monday morning at 8:30. I guess it would be 7:30 Mountain Time. And everything that I'm doing, I try to do it by looking at it through the lens of the great housing reversal, because it's been a very strong filter for me for helping me understand things. Mm-hmm. And then as it pertains to my book's available on Amazon. I self-published it, so it's only available on Amazon. But I will leave a little asterisk on my book. I'm in the process currently of preparing a second edition of the book, and it will go live. It will be published sometime between the middle of September and November 1st. I'm just trying to make a handful of decisions on its timing, but um, I've added structure to it. I've added more detail to it. I've cited work, where statistics are coming from, references. Um, I've added a glossary of terms to make it a more thorough, comprehensive, and complete work. Because what I did prior, while I'm very proud of it, was it reads like a series of essays as opposed to something that is you can refer to, where things are coming from, and something that has more meat to it. So if you become a subscriber, or you connect to me on LinkedIn, I will publish an article announcing its release, and hope you grab it. Grab the first edition. It's a great starting point, but know that what's coming out is greatly enhanced, and I'm really excited about that.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Mike, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. Quick additional plug for Wasatch Advocates for Livable Communities, or WALC for short. Everything we do in the realm of advocacy, public education, like a moment like this, and coalition building, is meant to expand housing choices and to repair the sort of mismatch that Mike has talked about today. So I'm going to throw our website in the chat. If you have not familiarized yourself with our work, please be in touch about the things that you're thinking about and ways that you may want to get involved in our work in the future. Thank you so much for your time, Mike. And thank
Thank you for the
you all.
opportunity.
Of course. Yeah. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us.